at WCS. She brings with her over 10 years of experience working to advance climate finance and policy incentives in the carbon market. And she's a JD from Harvard Law. And then we also have David McLaughlin as a senior economist at EDF. And he leads EDF's works on price forecasting and modeling with experience in environmental economics, public finance, and econometrics. And he has a PhD in agricultural and resource economics. And another author of the study, the paper, is Dylan McCall Landry, who's the director of sustainable finance. And he leads EDF's transaction support to jurisdictions and has experience in business strategy and financial analysis at McKinsey and Company, and as the CEO of Fuzu Limited, an African startup, and he has an MA in economics from Johns Hopkins. So thanks so much for everybody, and I'll hand it over to our speakers for today.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So I'm going to start with providing some of the background, an overview of what this ministry playbook really sets out to do. And then pass it over to Dave. So if we could move to the first slide, Dave. So nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, they serve as the foundation of the Paris Agreement's objective to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius with the ambition to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Countries are required to update their NDCs every 5 years to reflect increasing ambition and progress. However, there are many developing nations that face financial, technological, and capacity challenges in implementing these commitments. So addressing these challenges is especially important as the next round of NDC updates to 2030, because these will be critical for closing the significant emissions gap. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement requires countries to apply corresponding adjustments to their, or CAs, to their national emissions inventories when they authorize transactions for emission reductions and removals through bilateral and multilateral cooperative approaches. This is Article 6.2 and Article 6.4, in order to prevent double counting of internationally transferred emission reductions. So this is for authorized emission reductions and removals only. And despite Article 6 rules not being finalized yet, and Article 6.4 not being fully operational, countries are still eager to do deals, and we're seeing a steady increase in Article 6.2 agreements that are being brokered. There are also signs of increasing demand from countries like Singapore and compliance mechanisms such as CRCIA, such that around a quarter or 25% of demand for carbon credits to 2050 is expected to be for corresponding adjustment credits, or the equivalent of 1.19 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. So carbon corresponding adjustment credits are attractive as they're expected to have higher prices, with demand expected to remain robust in at least the near term due to initial limited supply. And a critical decision for jurisdictions now is whether to authorize these credits, because unlike voluntary carbon market credits, these credits cannot be counted toward their NDC since they're being transferred to the buyer's climate account. This forces the host country to find additional measures to offset the loss of carbon mitigation, which can increase the cost and complexity of achieving its NDC targets. So their selling corresponding adjustment credits introduces risks for countries, namely falling short of their NDC targets and potentially harming reputations among buyers who value integrity. And we're seeing that that's becoming a paramount concern for most buyers in the, at least the voluntary carbon market, and including compliance mechanisms. So the trading of corresponding adjustment credits occurs within a broader context of the overall integrity of the Paris Agreement, because the achievement of MDCs is basically the main engine for achieving global climate action, and maintaining the viability of the agreement itself. So countries need to balance the potential financial benefits of selling corresponding adjustment credits against the financial risks of overselling and then undermining their own climate goals. So this overselling before meeting NDC targets could have the perverse effect of actually lowering carbon prices and reducing demand for these very same corresponding adjustment credits because they're perceived to be weakening the foundation of the Paris Agreement. So in contrast, we are of the view that countries can benefit from keeping on track towards NDC achievement while considering strategies to mitigate these risks. And we're thinking particularly about the land sector, as there has been a significant growth in price premiums for forest carbon credits that are perceived as having high integrity. So do you want to can you move to the next slide, Dave? Thanks.
And as we do that, I'm so sorry. I apologize. I forgot to mention that we do have interpretation available for this webinar. So if you click the More button at the bottom of your screen, you can go to interpretation and choose the interpretation required. So I apologize for not alerting everyone to that at the beginning. Sorry about that.
So we wanted to answer the question, essentially, at what price point does it make sense for countries to authorize corresponding adjustment credits rather than sell credits in the voluntary carbon market in order to optimize their share of carbon finance and unlock significant financial resources and still be on track to meet their NDCs. So they're kind of breaking down that main question into components for national governments that are trying to implement jurisdictional RED programs. Questions like, what's your break-even price when you sell in the VCM? We have a little bit more of a history there, and EDF has generated a report on pricing in the next category, for jurisdictional RED credits. What is my break-even price for selling a credit with corresponding adjustments, and when do you choose to authorize and sell these credits versus non-corresponding adjustment credits to voluntary carbon markets buyers, who will remain around 75% of overall demand to 2050. And then for national governments who rely on subnational governments or indigenous territories for the implementation of jurisdictional RED programs, or the private sector, what price should they charge to authorize corresponding adjustment credits? And so we'll let Dave take over and explain the framework for this tool.
Thank you, Stephanie. So what is the playbook for corresponding adjustments? So Stephanie, I, Dylan, and Sarah, we sat down and thought about this question and thought that it would be useful to give guidance to host countries and tropical forest countries on how to think about corresponding adjustments, because it's not very straightforward. So we created this playbook with that in mind. So right here, the first thing that you need to do is you need to ensure that you have the regulatory policies and trading infrastructure in place to be able to conduct a transaction. Regulations. There could be some domestic regulations that kind of hinder or prevent the sale of carbon rights. So it's important to know the regulatory policies and trading infrastructure beforehand. Next, and this is probably, I've looked at many of these NDCs. There are so many, and if you look at all of them at the same time, it can be overwhelming. But a country needs to set an NDC, and they have to set an ambitious yet pragmatic 5-year NDC for 2030, and countries have, and you have to know your NDC. It's not just to make one, but to also know what it is. It needs to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, and it has to have sector-specific. It can have sector-specific contributions and commitments, although sometimes it is like volumetric. It's just a quantity-based. But that's the critical first step. Next, countries need a MAC curve. So a MAC curve is a marginal abatement cost curve, and you can think of this as organizing all of the abatement options in your economy or in your country, and organizing them based on their costs, from least cost to most costly, and the width of them would be corresponding to the amount of emissions reductions you would get from engaging in that activity, and then the height would correspond to the price. So a marginal abatement cost curve, we talk about these a lot in environmental economics. They're critical to understanding how to do a mitigation cost effectively. And so it's very important that these exist and that they're utilized in this approach. They would include forestry, and this actually helps you understand how best to get to your NDC. Most countries likely have these MAC curves in one of their ministries, but not necessarily, and some of them are outdated. So it's really important to reforecast your MAC or to basically re-estimate your MAC curve periodically, because costs can change, and then the amount of emissions reductions that are available can also change up or down. So then you would need to evaluate the NDC impact of a potential transaction. So if you were being approached by a company or a country to transact, there's a certain amount of emissions reductions that they're asking for. It's a quantity that they're asking for. And that's going to have an impact on the country's ability to meet its NDC. And so we need to know what that is. It's basically just knowing that quantity. Corresponding adjustments, they require higher abatement across the economy if you still want to achieve your NDC. So it's basically when you sell, you're more or less selling a right to the emissions reduction claim when you sell a carbon credit with corresponding adjustments. And that comes with it an additional responsibility of meeting your NDC through additional emissions reductions. So MAC curves help you evaluate that. So the next step 4, is to look at the break-even pricing. So there's not just one market. There's two. There's the VCM, which is the voluntary carbon market, which does not require corresponding adjustments. It's actually been active for quite some time. Red Plus represents a large share of this market. JRED is relatively new, but expected to have large quantities transacting. But again, like I said, it does not require a corresponding adjustment. So you have this other market that you could sell it in, and it's the voluntary carbon market, or you could sell a correspondingly adjusted credit. And this basically to do your break-even pricing, and I'll show you in a minute. There's a way of calculating what you would need to get in the voluntary carbon market, what you would need to get in the corresponding adjustments market, and then how to make a decision between them. So break-even pricing is just figuring out what the price is to break even on costs. Next, the final step is developing your sales strategy based on the break-even pricing. So if you exceed your break-even price in either the voluntary carbon market or the corresponding adjustments market, you can have a strategy about when you would sell in the voluntary carbon market or the corresponding adjustments market. And having a sales strategy is really important because you might also want to there's risk management. So you might want to decide to sell shares in either. You might want to just decide to sell up to a certain point in one and in the corresponding adjustments market, and then sell some in the voluntary carbon market. But having a strategy going into negotiations is really important. It allows you to make things like counter offers. It allows you to evaluate offers that you've been presented with, maybe different offers in different markets. I think that's really important to be able to compare prices so that you don't have regret later. I think that's if you do a little bit of thinking and a little bit of planning up front, it will help you convince other leadership in your governments, but then also it'll also help you have limited regrets afterwards. But it's important. It's a very important thing. So, okay, I'll move on from here. So, like I said earlier, the MAC curve, basically steps 2 through 5, you need to be kind of iterating. on those. So you'll go through it once, and then you'll need to update your MAC curves, and that will change the impact of a transaction. It'll also change the break-even prices, and then your sales strategy will have to be modified. So this is a continual process. This is not something that's static. It's something that it needs to be part of a process, I guess I would say. Okay, so let's dive into, so just before I go, I'm going to dive into each one of these and give a graphical interpretation that I hope is helpful. But if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And then also there'll be a Q&A, probably a pretty extended Q&A at the end. So I look forward to those questions, but I'll dive into each one of these now. So step one, set 2030 NDCs. I think everybody probably who's here might know this already, but you have to have NDCs that align with the Paris Agreement. Each country has their own, and they're common but differentiated responsibilities. You want to engage Indigenous peoples, local communities, women and youth. You want to make sure that these are in line with the Paris Agreement. That's a critical thing. When I talk about this NDCs with economists, I relate this to essentially like a global cap and trade. It's very similar to that in the sense that NDCs set up what every country is going to do towards their own targets, but the targets themselves, the amount of emissions that they're continuing to emit, is almost like a free allocation in a cap and trade system. So free allocation is like the amount that you're allowed to continue to emit, and these corresponding adjustments are in essence like the trade part of a cap and trade you could think about. So also with NDCs, you have the sectoral focus for emissions reductions. So forestry, not every NDC has forestry in it. I've looked at a handful, some do. And for those that do, it's like it's part of your, there might be different guidance here, and I'll mention that later. But if it is part of your NDC, it's an unconditional NDC. And then if it's not, if the forestry sector is not part of your NDC, but is part of your conditional NDC, the guidance will be different. So it's important to be aware of where forestry JRED plus lands in your NDC. So here's a diagram, and I'm going to be returning to this diagram throughout the talk. So I want to get everyone familiar with it from the offset, and it may seem fairly simple but I'm going to build on it. So in economics, we like to draw graphs a lot, and one of the most common graphs we draw is there's quantity on the x-axis. So this is the horizontal line you see below. That's the quantity of emissions reductions that are potential, basically quantity of emissions reductions. I'll just say that. On the y-axis, you have price. So this is dollars per ton of CO2. So this is how we draw our graphs typically. And then if we can draw this graph, we can also draw a vertical dotted line or dashed line, which represents the NDC. So that is some quantity of emissions reductions, and it's at some point that the country has determined. So step two, you have to establish a marginal abatement cost curve. So I mentioned this earlier. MAC curves are really important for planning on how a country will achieve its NDC. If you don't use a MAC curve, you could choose emissions reductions that are more expensive than you need to. So it's useful to have this MAC curve as almost like a roadmap for what emissions reductions are least cost, so that you don't end up spending too much money. You can use that money for other things. Governments need to balance budgets and all that. So it's important to have kind of a roadmap, and the MAC curves are really key to that. So MAC curves, they estimate the cost of achieving NDCs. Like you can look at the area under the MAC curve to figure out how much money you need to expend to meet your NDC, and assess viable decarbonization paths. So the MAC curve, an example is like a MAC curve will depict forestry abatement costs versus other sectors. Yeah, so you can compare emissions reductions across your economy with a MAC curve. So for JRED plus, you want to include all your costs in a MAC curve. So that's every cost that you would incur in doing the JRED plus program. You could think about MRV payments for practice or payments for ecosystem services. Different JRED programs are structured differently and have different cost structures in their own context. So it's not you almost want to do your own accounting here. You can look at other countries to have as a guide, but local context is really critical. Also, paired with JRED plus, there's a lot of it's not enough to just really estimate the costs that way. A lot of these need to be worked through benefit sharing plans. You also need to understand how much. So benefit sharing plans are important, and for those who are less familiar, it's how to split the proceeds of carbon credit sales. It's really important that those are negotiated and early, and not later. You want to make sure that you have these costs that reflect the true cost of producing these credits. One, to like make sure that it's fair, but then also to make sure that you are able to deliver, so that there's no delivery risk. So yeah, it's very important to make sure you have all of the costs in place. Economists do this all the time. EDF, at EDF, we've done MAC curves. There's also public information, not public, but sometimes behind a paywall information on MAC curves for different sectors. The forestry sector and land use sector is a little bit more tough, but there are lots of methodologies out there and countries who have done this before. So it's if you haven't done it, that's okay. And there's a lot of experts in the world, but then also and here, but then there's also it shouldn't be too tough to engage in that. So I'm going to show you just what a MAC curve looks like. If you haven't seen one, if you have seen one, apologies. This MAC curve is, like I mentioned, the x-axis is quantity. So the width of each of these boxes it corresponds to the quantity of emissions reductions in each bin. We've drawn this not in a continuous way. Normally, economists like to draw continuous functions because then we can take derivatives. But in this example, it's a kind of a simplified example where it's very discrete. There's lots of boxes here. So each box corresponds to a different emissions reduction pathway, and the width is the quantity, and the height is the price. So you can see that you can overlay this on your graph, and then the vertical line, the NDC, comes down at some point. Now, if I were running a country, I would want to do this. There's lots of this is a stylized example, so there are lots of limitations to where you can get emissions reductions from. So not every country can do this perfectly, and I wouldn't expect that. But if you were trying to minimize costs, you would do all of the emissions reductions to the left of the NDC. But there might be political considerations, there might be other limitations. So the real world has complexity. So it's not always possible to do everything to the left of the NDC. So step 3, so assess the NDC impact of authorizing a corresponding adjustment. So this is contingent on the deal that you're considering. It's really important to know the quantity of emissions reductions you might be potentially selling, and to evaluate the impact. And just a reminder, and we've said this in the beginning, CA credits don't count towards the host country's NDC. So this requires additional abatement, and that's like the key. I think that's the key to everything. to understanding corresponding adjustments is it's not just simply the price of generating the credit. It's the option. It's the opportunity to surrender it as part of your NDC, or the requirement that you'll need to make up those emissions reductions when you sell it. So this is like kind of like a hidden cost. It's a cost that's not obvious. And economists love thinking about these costs. It's like a little puzzle, to look at when you're thinking about it. But if you don't pay attention to it and you're in a certain context, then it can be very costly. So it's important, and there could be reputational effects if you get this wrong. And so it's important to be thinking carefully. So yeah, like I mentioned, selling CA credits often means moving to costlier mitigation options. So like let's go back to our figure here. So to evaluate the NDC impact, suppose you have a this green box corresponds to a JRED plus program, and it's to the left of your NDC. And let's just say it's part of your NDC, I think, in this case. There's a certain quantity which corresponds to X. So you can see there's a little X that's measuring the width of this box. And that would be the impact. That's how many credits you might be intending to sell, or would you be asked for to sell. And then, so what happens is you have to look at where your NDC lies, and you have to look at the quantity of emissions reductions, the X quantity to the right. And so you can see the width of the JRED box corresponds to the width of the box to the right of the NDC. And that would be your next best abatement option. And you can see that the height of that next best abatement option is considerably higher than the JRED cost. So it's not simply the JRED cost that you should be considering and some markup above that, but there's actually a considerably larger markup that you'll be on the hook for or responsible for if you engage in a correspondingly adjusted transaction. So step 4, and I'm sure there might be questions. I haven't been looking closely at the chat, but I think I'm happy to answer questions later. So step 4, like if we remember, it's understanding the break-even pricing in the voluntary carbon market and the corresponding in the adjusted market. So there are different conditions. I don't want to confuse anyone, but this is not always. It's not always perfectly straightforward. It depends on whether the national government would have otherwise or would not have otherwise undertaken the cost of JRED. But it also depends on your progress towards your NDC. There's many different considerations that you need to take on your path of determining the break-even price in the corresponding adjusted market, and it's similarly in the VCM. So let's look at this one specific split, like where there's a national. Let's assume that there's a national government that would not otherwise undertake JRED. So you can think of it as like a conditional NDC, and so the guidance here. This is kind of a high level. And I'll show you in a figure in a second. So you should sell in the VCM if the VCM credit price covers the JRED costs in this case. So if it's a conditional NDC, and then in the corresponding adjusted market, you'd want to sell if this. I'm sorry. Let me just look at this for a second. Apologies. Yes, no, I have this right. So it's confusing for me sometimes too. So what I would say here is, so if you would not otherwise undertake the cost of JRED, so if you're in a conditional NDC situation, you would sell in the VCM if the VCM credit price covers the JRED costs. So that seems pretty logical. Like you want to be able to cover your costs with some margin. So there's like a profit margin. And with regards to the corresponding adjustment market, you want to make sure that you are able to cover the JRED costs, as well as the cost of the next best abatement option, plus some profit margin. And I'll show you that. That'll be the next figure I show you. So I won't go into the second one until afterwards, but it's different. So this is the image. So you can, this is not typically how an economist would draw it, but it's a way of visualizing it for the audience here. If you sell at cost, you're not making any money, you're not losing any money, you're kind of indifferent of whether you should have undertaken this transaction. So there is a margin, a profit margin, which is this little pie profit above the costs that you need to kind of build in to make it worthwhile for the country to do this. But the idea is on the left, you have the break-even price for the voluntary carbon market. And so that's this purple dotted line above the profit box, which cost of JRED plus profit is equal to the price of the VCM. Now, in the price of the corresponding adjustment market, you need to also incorporate this next best abatement option. And that's like pretty consistent across all different contexts. The next best abatement option is always something that you need to be considering whenever you're in a world where you're considering a corresponding adjustment. If you're below this is not shown in this diagram, but if you were not on track to meet your NDC, corresponding adjustments are quite expensive. Like you shouldn't really even be considering them if you're not on track to meet your NDC. They make it even harder to meet your NDC. In other words, right? So many countries that should be considering these things are near or very close or are exceeding their NDC. So I just want to reiterate that. And then, okay, so then I'll go into this. I just went back to look at the second bullet here. So national governments who would undertake the cost of JRED. So this is like in the case of an unconditional NDC, where JRED is part of an unconditional NDC. You would want to obtain the highest possible voluntary carbon market credit price. And I'll explain that in a second. And then you would only sell a CA credit if the CA credit covers the next best abatement option. So it's a little different. The underlying assumption is a little bit different because in this market, you might be doing JRED, you might be in the middle of doing JRED, and you might have been doing this anyway. And that's an important consideration too. Or you're not deciding whether or not to do JRED. It's already something that you've committed to doing. And so then you want to recover as much of the cost as possible in the VCM, but still in the corresponding adjustments market, you need to cover the emissions reductions that you'll be responsible for, or that you're committed to if you sell a corresponding adjustment. So now we'll just turn to developing a sales strategy. Countries need to balance their economic returns and make sure they achieve their NDCs. So governments should, like I mentioned earlier, governments should only sell corresponding adjustments if they're going to meet or exceed their NDC, or if the price for corresponding adjustments are sufficiently high. So there are some scenarios or some situations where the corresponding adjustment price might be very, very high. And it should be high because there's a premium, but it might be high for a variety of reasons. Demand skyrockets. Corsia needs corresponding adjustments. There's lots of other demand that could show up on the scene before there's sufficient quantity. And so you could have large prices. So there are conditions, but you have to know what those conditions are. You can't just look at a price and say it's high. You have to do the math to make sure that is sufficiently high and then you have to paired with that transaction, you likely also have to talk to the work with your government and commit yourself to that next best abatement option, because you could, if you don't do that, then you could sell something and then later on it might be something that you try to negotiate with your country and you've weakened your standing in the carbon market. So you want to make sure you pair this transaction with the next best abatement option. So then you can come up with a pricing formula for corresponding adjustments, sales decisions. So again, like I mentioned, the key insight is just to include the next best abatement option as a country specific premium. So every country is going to have their own MAC curve, and those MAC curves are not all going to look the same. And so everyone's going to have their own, every country will have its own premium that they have to include for corresponding adjustments. And so they're not going to all be the same. And depending on the context, like I mentioned earlier, this also includes JRED plus costs. So just like you also, like I think I mentioned this earlier, this is the whole crux of this is making sure that you have your NDC attainment, you have your MAC curves, and you understand future prices. So this is something I didn't go into. We're assuming prices are kind of are static in these diagrams, but prices change as well, and having a good handle on what's happening with prices will help you make better decisions today, and also price forecasts. EDF and JTAP, where we're engaged in price forecasting in the voluntary carbon market, and looking into price forecasts. It's a bit more difficult to do in the corresponding adjustments market, but getting estimates of correspondingly adjusted prices for different countries. And doing this allows you to avoid NDC shortfall, which, like Stephanie was saying, could be a reputational risk in the carbon market. So it could affect your ability to transact in future transactions, or losses. So if you have to either go to the corresponding adjustment spot market, which means to buy a corresponding adjustment when you realize that you didn't budget correctly, that can be very expensive. So you want to avoid shortfalls, and you want to avoid unexpected losses. So this is like a simplification. It's pretty. it simplifies the ideas, but I'll try to describe this sales strategy, and I'll just check the time. Yeah. So this is like a way of, picture this like a dartboard kind of. That's how I think about it. Although not everybody plays darts, but I used to play a lot. This like the axes are different here. So if you look at the y-axis, that's the price in the voluntary carbon market, and then the x-axis is the price in the correspondingly adjustment market, the CA market. And so if you can draw this diagram, a point on this diagram would represent some prices that you're seeing in the market today. So you could draw a little point, or maybe it's even an offer. Maybe you have offers from different parties, and you could represent an offer, a pair of offers on this diagram. And so each region on this diagram has been drawn with respect to the previous playbook. And so you have in the bottom left corner a square that the green square, which represents the cost of JRED, and then the next best abatement option is in pink, and then you have this kind of profit margin, which is it's not exactly an L shape. But it's kind of a little white region. And then you have these two larger regions, which say sell VCM, sell CA. So again, this is a stylized example, but if you had a point that fell in the green square, would you do this? You would be selling, but you'd be selling at a loss. This is also if this is part of your conditional NDC. This is a conditional NDC diagram. And so you wouldn't want to sell your credits at a VCM price where it fell into that green square. Now, if the price fell into the sell VCM region, so if we're in the sell CA region, then you might want to sell in either of those markets, but it depends on the relative prices, which is why the regions are not symmetric. Then they're not symmetric because of the next best abatement option. So the next best abatement option is relevant in the CA market because you are responsible for additional emissions reductions, but it does not factor into the VCM market. So you don't see that next best abatement option appearing on the y-axis. So this is just like an idea where if you have a sales strategy, once you have break-even prices, you can create this sales strategy about when you sell at what prices. It allows you to generate, it allows you to evaluate deals, but it also allows you to generate your own deals of where you think it would be better. And again, this is a stylized example, but there are other slightly more sophisticated approach. Like you would do this in a you have a computer program that would do this and then create this kind of these regions and this like kind of landscape of prices. And then so here, again, this next best abatement option, the corresponding adjustment puts the NDC at risk. So that's why you have to include that cost. Now there's like another case where you're talking about an unconditional NDC, and unconditional NDCs are a little bit different, and they're different for good reason. They're different because you are committing to JRED as part of what you're doing anyway, and so then there's actually like very little regret for selling in the VCM market. However, you still need to be considering the next best abatement option whenever you're deciding to sell a CA. So the VCM, it's a lot easier to come up with a good reason. It can actually help finance and spin up a project that's in your conditional NDC. But the corresponding adjustment comes with this additional cost that always needs to be accounted for. And even though it's a higher price, it may not be sufficiently high to cover your emissions reductions. So now, what are the main takeaways here? So, we need NDCs are critical. I mean, like, this is how we make sure we don't exceed 2 degrees warming. It's a bottom-up approach, and countries have chosen this. It's really critical to the integrity of the globe. This playbook allows for countries to navigate the trade-offs of corresponding adjustments. It's kind of the first step in doing that. We'll probably be developing additional work on this that will, and then more tailored approaches for each country, because this is what is going to require. But this is kind of conceptual paper to help create awareness, but then also to lay the foundation for actually advising countries through JTAP. And it provides strategic insights for carbon credit sales. So it stresses that governments must be careful to balance their financial benefits of selling carbon credits with their need to meet their NDCs. So break-even prices and a sales strategy. That's what we're saying here. So I'll stop here just so we can take questions. Should I no longer? Oh yeah, thank you so much. I mean, I want to thank everybody. Here's a QR code. You probably also received the link in the chat, so I don't have to keep this up there. But please feel free to reach out to me, to Dylan, to Stephanie, to Sarah. I think right now it'd be me and Stephanie. Please just send an email if you have a question, if you want to follow up, if you want to have a meeting. Happy to do that. So excited to hear your questions and meet some of you. Thanks. Stephanie, did you want, or Sarah, did you want to take questions? Or I'm not sure the format beyond here. I think somebody's going to moderate.
Sure. Please place any questions you have in the chat, or feel free to just raise your hand to let us know if you have any particular questions. I think this playbook provides a great introduction to something that is going to be something countries will be having the challenge in front of them for the next couple of years. So really looking forward to assisting countries as they move towards this progression. Sorry, the lighting is all, the sun has come out here. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask our speakers today? Okay. David, I'll just start off. What do you see if you were to kind of to distill this? What is some of the first initial assessment steps that a country should be making, and what kind of expertise do they really need to bring to the table in order to do so?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I mean, I think legal expertise is probably is probably at the top of the list. We have some lawyers here who have been, hearing from countries that it's a very expensive thing to engage in. So when you talk about costs, it's like high transaction costs. Lawyers typically have high transaction costs. It's hard to find good legal experience, especially evaluating deals. But then also just understanding whether you can engage in a transaction through your local laws. So I think that actually is something that I'm seeing a lot of. Uh, Financial experience or just experience in ability, like market analysis, I think is the other item. And JTAP is trying to spin up and offer these kinds of services, and I think very soon we will have a few examples of this where we've provided technical assistance in these two domains. But those two, in my opinion, are the most important. Yeah.
And one of the things I'm a little bit afraid of is that countries will see this as such a monumental task. They might be a little bit frozen with concerns about where to go next. And so what are some things that are kind of a little bit more no regrets that countries can start to proceed on while these other aspects of things get figured out?
Yeah, I mean, and Stephanie, please chime in. I have like a few ideas here, but I'm definitely not the authority here. I think a lot of these things exist in ministries. I think but specifically the MAC curves. I think that they often do exist. I know many examples of MAC curves that I've seen through the Forest Carbon Partnership Fund. Like there's a lot of public MAC curves. Like you can, if you just look around, you can find MAC curves for different countries that make them available. But it's it it I think one of the hard things to do is to know how much folks would be willing to accept for payments for practice or payments for ecosystem services. There are some experiments that are underway that have been conducted. There's some literature that suggests that, but every country is going to have a different different communities that will accept or will not accept certain prices. So I think it's really important. Like the MAC curve is actually kind of difficult in some parts and might require some investment. Now that might be intimidating, right? But there are experts. There are folks that can give you guidance on to where to look to find an estimate or or how to design an experiment or a pilot study to evaluate how folks will respond to a program. And starting small is always better. So like you don't want to dive in headfirst if you're unsure of the depth. So you want to make sure that you can spend a little bit, or maybe you can even leverage your interest by getting financing to look into some of these questions. But it is there are many experts out there. I'll say that, and I think that so JTAP has some experts, WCS, EDF, Conservation International. I think if you just reach out to us, I love talking, but I also love connecting people to experts. And I think that just reaching out and that first email it's just send an email. You don't even have to have the question, but if you just want to have a conversation, I think that's a great way to spin things up. And then you get a concept, and then you figure out who can help fund that concept. But different countries are going to be in different places, and maybe some are in the negotiation phase, some are just even thinking about the beginning of this phase. Like they're not even at the MAC curve phase, or they don't understand their NDCs. But I think we're here to like help in any way to bring you from wherever you are to where you want to go. So I think it'd be really good to reach out to JTAP, any of us, and we'll direct you in the right way. And Stephanie, if you have anything else to add there.
Oh yeah, just to introduce JTAP a little bit. It's the Jurisdictional Red Plus Technical Assistance Partnership. And it's a collaboration of WCS, EDF, Conservation International, Winrock, and Climate Law and Policy. And I'll look for the website and paste it in the chat in a second. But we try to cover basically all the needs from transaction issuance readiness to transaction readiness. And this is for essentially credits from jurisdictional RED programs that will be targeting the voluntary carbon market and potentially, as we've talked about here, compliance mechanisms that would require corresponding adjustments. And I think one thing that countries can do is to start assessing what would be the cost and budgeting and capacity building needed for compliance with one of these standards, carbon standards like Vera JNR or our trees, because we're seeing that countries that are really leaders in demonstrating early demand, countries like Singapore are really requiring this kind of high level of integrity that's kind of joining the voluntary carbon market and Article 6 and like conformance and adherence to these carbon standards rather than just existing UNFCCC mechanisms. And so that would be a good place to start if you're actually thinking about trying to access carbon finance, is really thinking about how you're going to comply with the carbon standards and go through that process. And those need to be part of the cost of implementation, is basically.
Great. And I might just add a small additional answer to my question, which is, I think one of the things that I've seen is that sometimes there's a little bit of confusion at the very beginning to decide who in the government needs to be in the room to help make these decisions. So I think that's also another initial first step, is trying to figure out what is the role of different ministries, what level of the government needs to be involved in different aspects of decision making, and getting clarity within the government on what the role is of different actors as you start to go on this process. Because I've seen sometimes where that has not been figured out really early on, and then they get partway through, and then there's a lot of circling around trying to figure out, did we actually incorporate everybody who needed to be at the table? Oh, wait, now we have to go back and start over with this other ministry. And so really, I mean, of course, that's always going to happen a little bit, but really thinking it through at the beginning, what is the role of the different aspects of the government? And as you said, David, what technical expertise already actually exists in the government that can be pulled upon and brought into this conversation? Often, there's really great expertise in other ministries that might not really have been historically all that involved in the forestry sector or the land use sector, but actually exist in the country that can be brought in to assist in this pathway, especially on the legal and the financial side. Great. I don't see people are not interested, not feeling very vocal this morning. I apologize. We don't have any additional questions.
That's okay. Yeah, no, I
David,
would,
Stephanie, any final remarks? Anything you're one to think people should look at as we head towards the next COP?
well, yeah. So I mean, my email, I just dropped my email in the chat. So it was also at the end of the slides. It's probably also in the report. So like, I just encourage anybody to come up to me and send an email. I had great conversations at New York Climate Week when we presented this. And some of those are starting to continue. And I think that like, just please reach out so that we can converse and talk more. If you don't want to ask your question right now, I feel like you could ask your question by email. There's no bad questions here. But yeah, I also I want to do more on this. So I think that there's a lot of like really interesting nuances. Every country is different, and I think that being able to explore that academically is interesting. But then it's also there's a huge applied component. So it's very I think what I would say is this is not simple, and it's good to pair up relative experiences to try to solve this problem, and to walk through each experience and then try to you can generalize, but there's a lot of specific information that needs to be brought to bear here. And yeah, just excited to continue to explore this space with you all, with WCS especially, because this has been a very fruitful collaboration, but then more broadly with everybody who wants to engage. So I don't know. I'm excited about the opportunities here. But Stephanie, do you have anything else?
Yeah, I'd just like to close with saying that this is a really prime opportunity or in terms of a window of time for countries to be considering all these questions. It, at COP, there's hope that there could be some final resolution of Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 in terms of registry rules, reporting requirements, and authorization, issues around authorization. And there's also going to be a great focus on finance. But what we already know is that carbon markets and specifically carbon finance have existed already, are already operational. And we expect there to be consistent and growing demand through 2050. And so this is one way countries can actually have a really stronger assurance that their efforts to implement their NDCs and attract greater finance to support that increasing ambition and progress, like there is a practical, realistic, and potential for growth through this process specifically. So,
Excellent.
yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. And looking forward to seeing what happens at this upcoming COP. Will be an interesting.
And we will also have a recording available to share. So yeah, if you can pass it around to your colleagues, people who were not able to attend today, that would be great also. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.